There is no doubt the Australian economy is struggling, but we've somehow managed to avoid an official recession. Today, I'm going to share with you how the federal government managed to avoid the recession, how they actually made average Australians poorer through the process, and finally, the scary impact this could have on property prices. Let's dive in. Hello, it's Nero here, and if you're new to my channel, hit that subscribe button because I talk about all things related to the Australian economy and the Australian property market. First, let's begin by looking at just how sick the Australian economy is. When we look at the gross domestic product or GDP growth rates in Australia, we can see that as of the latest data, the economy only grew by 0.8%. That's the lowest in over 30 years. That's right, you need to go back to the early 1990s recession to see figures this low. And you can see that our economy has been growing by smaller and smaller amounts since the peak back in June 2021. However, as bad as these growth figures are, a recession is defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. What that means is that a recession is only officially declared when the Australian economy reduces for 2 quarters in a row. But that hasn't happened, as bad as our economic growth figures are. However, that's not the full picture. When we look at this next chart produced by Macro Business, what we can see is that the per capita GDP has actually been reducing for multiple quarters in a row. So what that means is that per person, on average in Australia, we have less to spend because we're generating less economic output. Put simply, the average Australian has been getting poorer even though our economy is not in a recession. And in this next chart, we can see that the real per capita household disposable income has been falling away quite dramatically. This again confirms that per household, we have less money to spend because our cost of living crisis is so bad in Australia. So yes, on average, Australians have been getting poorer. But then how has the federal government enabled this to happen? Well, it's been a 2-step process. Number one, if we look at job creation in Australia, as we can see in this chart, where we separate the number of jobs being created in the private sector, which is the blue line, versus the government sector, which is the orange line. What we can see is that government jobs has gone through the roof while private sector jobs is rapidly dwindling. So therefore, the government has been spending big to create jobs, primarily in the healthcare industry, but across multiple other government-related industries in order to try and stimulate the economy. And this is a big reason why unemployment has not risen as fast as many people have expected. It's still sitting at around 4%, primarily because of government spending to create jobs. But the question is, where is the government getting all its money from in order to spend to create these jobs? Well, there's really only 2 ways the government can actually create an income. Number one, they can try and sell stuff. Well, the federal government doesn't really own a great deal to be able to sell anything. So then the second way they can earn an income is by increased tax revenues. Now, imagine this scenario. We have the worst cost of living crisis we've had in recent living memory, and then the government decides to go and increase taxes on people. What do you think would happen? There'd be chaos, a revolt in the streets. The government would almost immediately lose power. So they can't do that. So then what have they done? They've gone and increased migration to increase tax revenues. That's one of the reasons why we've had such an increase in migration. It's allowed the government to increase its revenue, but then immigration is now starting to fall from its record high levels. Now I know it's still well above long-term averages, but migration is starting to fall. But then if migration starts to fall, that means then that the government can't earn as much in terms of tax revenue, which then means it either has to stop spending or go and print money, something called quantitative easing, which is something we saw back after COVID, but they're not going to do that because that will then increase inflation again. We know that from what happened after the pandemic. So therefore, what's going to happen? The government will need to stop spending, which will then contract our economy even further, which will then mean that the only option left on the table is for the Reserve Bank to drop interest rates. Now, what happens to property prices though if the federal government finally stops spending as much money as it has been, our economy gets even sicker, and we do go into a full-blown official recession? Well, have a look at this. Here we have a chart looking at property prices all the way back to 1991. And what we can see is there have been 6 periods in total where nominal house price growth was negative. What that means is there have been 6 periods where house prices have fallen. However, look at how much they actually fell. You can see that the biggest price fall was in 2009, just after the global financial crisis we had, where property prices on average fell 5.4%. Then we saw another price fall back in 2011. Prices fell 2.34%. Then we saw property prices falling in 2018, 2019. The price fall was less than 5%. But look what's happened every time property prices have fallen. They've risen dramatically afterwards. In fact, if you go back and look at every single economic crisis or recession Australia's had, soon afterwards, property prices have increased quite dramatically. And that's been driven by 2 things. Number 1, interest rates falling, which increases people's borrowing capacities. And secondly, the housing shortage that we've had in Australia, which right now is bigger than it's ever been on record. So while the federal government has made the average Australian poorer, the data doesn't lie. What this also shows me is that if you're someone who is secure in your job and you can afford to buy property in the right locations, the odds are that those properties will rise in value and become even more expensive than they are right now, based on the fundamentals of our economy and what's happened every single time after an economic crisis. Now, of course, that does not mean you can buy blindly. Prices won't rise everywhere. They will, though, rise in multiple locations around the country. So if you want help to find the best locations and you're someone who can afford to buy property, then check out the link in the description below to get totally for free the audio version and digital version of my book. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.